Thank you all for joining our webinar tonight. We're just going to be talking about a few of the things that MEIC has been working on in regards to climate action in the state. Acknowledging that there are tons of groups working on tons of different campaigns, and a lot of what we work on is in conjunction with those groups. And so this is just going to be focusing on our little parts. And then we do have a guest at the end of the call to talk about the Held v. State of Montana case and give an update on that. So very grateful to have Barbara Chillcot with Western Environmental Law Center with us tonight as well. And with that, let's jump right in with Anne. Oh, and here's what we're going to be talking about. So we'll start with the Supreme Court hearing tomorrow. And then Durf will talk to us about the MEPA working group he's been participating in, some really interesting updates with the PSC petition for rulemaking on considering climate impacts are happening. And then, like I said, we'll end with some updates about Held v. State of Montana. And now I'll send it over to Anne.
Okay. So tomorrow morning, we have our day in court. We're really excited to get our case regarding the Yellowstone County Generating Station. It's Northwestern's gas-fired power plant near Laurel that it has been building for the last couple of years, and trying to duck out of any state oversight every chance it gets. The Department of Environmental Quality a few years ago gave Northwestern Energy an air permit for this plant, to build this plant. But in that permitting process, it did not consider climate change. It said it was not allowed to because in 2011, at that time, the legislature had adopted a law that many of us here tonight fought back in 2011 to say that the state's not allowed to consider any impacts that are global, regional in nature, and beyond Montana's borders. And we argued at that time that we have a constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment, and that the failure for the state to be able to consider climate change, which this provision was absolutely intended to prevent, we argued that that would undermine our constitutional rights. We've been arguing that that 2011 MEPA exemption or MEPA limitation has been misconstrued by the state or is unconstitutional for a very long time. Because ultimately, that provision did not say that they couldn't consider climate change. They tried to be kind of tricky. They tried to not use the word climate change, but instead say impacts that are global or regional in nature. Well, when we challenged the DEQ decision under the Montana Environmental Policy Act, saying you failed to consider climate change, the district court about a year ago now said, well, DEQ, I don't even have to reach the constitutional issue. That plain language of the statute requires you to consider those impacts to the climate within Montana's borders. Well, as many of you know, that caused quite a ruckus in the legislature, and they quickly suspended all their rules and they adopted a new law that said that was very explicit, saying that DEQ absolutely 100% did not need to consider climate change in a MEPA analysis. The Held case, our Children's Trust case, and the one that Barbara and Melissa Hornbein with Western Environmental Law Center both worked on, took issue with that provision, with that new law. And that is the law that the district court in the Held case threw out as unconstitutional. We were very happy about that, but it still leaves the 2011 law potentially in place, which is the law we were fighting over to begin with. So we are now before the Supreme Court on that same case. We are arguing that the district court either got it right, and by requiring the state to consider greenhouse gas emissions in its MEPA analysis, and if the district court, was wrong, and that the 2011 language does not allow DEQ to consider climate change at all, then that limitation is unconstitutional. We will be in court tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Where oral arguments will start. It should be a very great hearing. Earth Justice Jenny Harbine will be arguing on our behalf. And it's a really consequential decision because it hopefully will mean that the DEQ can no longer just ignore climate change, that the legislature can't prevent DEQ from considering climate change in permitting processes, and that this gas plant that Northwestern has been building has been illegally constructed because they've in fact did not follow the law and get a valid air quality permit because it did not comply with MEPA and the obligation under the Constitution to consider the climate. So it's a little convoluted and complex, but it's a really important case. We're super excited to hear the oral arguments tomorrow, and we're certain that our justice is going to knock it out of the park. Because of course, the DEQ, as the Department of Environmental Quality, should be considering climate change when it is issuing permits for large gas plants that are going to have serious climate implications for the state and the nation. So that's our first issue. The next one up is DERF.
Hey everyone, lots of friendly faces. Durf Johnson. I'm the Deputy Director of MEIC. And the next thing we're chatting about is this MEPA working group. Basically, what happened is based upon the success that we had in our litigation against the Laurel gas plant, as well as the held decision, the Montana DEQ basically formulated this working group as well as listening sessions. Many of you participated in those listening sessions last fall. And there was this big, robust record that we had with lots of great comments, overwhelmingly in support of DEQ analyzing climate. Since January, I have been participating in a stakeholder group along with a few other conservation interests, citizens, industry, etc., to see whether there is any consensus on recommendations for how DEQ would approach the analysis of climate. And we are starting to get towards the end of that process. I'm going to drop right into the chat the most recent calendar that we have. Basically, we've broken up into 3 groups: the climate analysis subgroup, the process and applicability subgroup, and the outreach and public participation subgroup. I guess the bigger picture here is that it's not just climate that may be potentially impacted by these recommendations. It's the MEPA process in general. And so MEIC has been approaching this on sort of a 2-part agenda. One is to protect MEPA and the public participation aspects that it affords, and 2 is to have a robust climate analysis. We have what I think is a close to final consensus recommendation on the climate analysis. It does not include a number of things that should be in there, including we believe that obviously DEQ should utilize what's called the social cost of carbon, which is a metric that the federal government developed to basically characterize pollution, put a number value on it, and put it into context, like how much harm will this particular project cause that we are analyzing. And the other thing is that we would like to see for DEQ analyze both the direct as well as the indirect emissions. Right now, DEQ is actually doing climate analyses because they are under a court order to conform with the held ruling, but they're only analyzing the site-specific emissions. And so you could have a coal mine, for example, that's going to generate millions and millions of tons of carbon pollution when that coal is burned, and that coal is almost certainly going to be burned. But that is being ignored at this point. DEQ is only looking at on-site emissions, the emissions from the trucks and the other equipment necessary to mine the coal. And that's problematic to us and doesn't really address the foreseeable, reasonable impacts associated with what it is that they're doing. And so there's a couple of places where you can plug in. And one of them is that DEQ currently has a website for this working group where the public can submit comments. Thank you, Katie. And we do continue to get comments, and I would really encourage you all to jump in and speak up on that. And the other one is that each of the working groups and each of the main MEPA stakeholder groups has public comment at the end. And I would also encourage you to jump in and to speak up on the protection of our climate and making sure that MEPA is fully protected. Katie, if you could jump to the next slide, we have sort of a set of 3 talking points that we would love for people to hit home on in their comments that they submit, their written comments, or if you decide to show up to one of the public comment periods, you can do it over Zoom. It's super easy. And the website that DEQ has up has the calendar and dates for when you can speak up on these things. So the final product, we will be certainly advertising, and there will be its own comment period. Hopefully we'll be able to get some useful things out of this process and some gains in terms of protecting our climate, especially with the backstop of HELD and the potential gas plant decision pushing DEQ along the way. So if you have any questions on that, just drop them into the chat or email me separately. And I think we're going to jump to our third item for the day next.
That's right. And we'll also have some time at the end of the call. So if you do have questions, we should have some time. So
great.
So one of the things that MEIC has been working as a whole team on since in the early fall was a rulemaking petition to the Montana Public Service Commission, asking it to adopt rules to require consideration of climate change and its regulation of gas and electric utilities. That's a mouthful, but ultimately what we were asking the Public Service Commission to do was its job. We're asking the Public Service Commission to quantify and make decisions based upon the risks that climate change poses to Montana customers, and to the environment. Many commissions, utility commissions across the country already do this. This is nothing that is unusual or difficult to do. It is something that the commission has resisted doing. We have multiple times, many of the people who engage in Public Service Commission proceedings have asked the commission to consider climate change in its decision-making, and it is always refused. It's really important. The Public Service Commission is very likely the most consequential entity in the state of Montana regarding the climate. When we think about where most of the emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions in the state come from, they are coming from fossil fuel power plants that we use to generate electricity. And that made sense decades ago, when we really didn't have good renewable energy resources, when we didn't have storage resources. We do now. We have technologies that not only are better than they were a long time ago, but produce so much energy on a regular basis and are being utilized all over the world. So the technologies have, in the last decade, have skyrocketed in their efficiency. Wind energy in Montana is fantastic. The state of Montana has one of the best wind resources in the United States. We have a great solar opportunity. We have storage technologies that are saving the California grid system because storage technology works. But yet the Public Service Commission still pretends like these are experimental technologies that cannot be relied on to provide power to customers on a regular basis. And that is simply false. So we asked the Public Service Commission in its decision-making on whether it would allow a utility to build a gas plant, for example, to consider what the harm would be from that gas plant's greenhouse gas emissions. That would provide it a comparison to other other energy resources that are cleaner, more affordable for customers. So we pulled together with a number of partners a really amazing group of 40 individual, but there's only one individual, but businesses like Big Sky, like Bridgerable, who's been a champion of this issue, a couple Montana breweries, faith-based groups, public health groups. We pulled together this wonderful group of people and organizations and businesses to ask the Public Service Commission to adopt a rule. This is not an unusual process. People regularly ask bodies of government to adopt rules on issues that they are concerned about. The law allows it, and the law has very strict procedures that you have to follow in order to petition for a rule, and that the agency that you have asked to adopt a rule has to follow in order to consider your request. So we went to them and we filed on February 28th with all of these other wonderful entities from across the state and asked the Public Service Commission to do its job. The Public Service Commission held a hearing on April 8th, and that hearing in the morning was just so heartening. There was just incredible testimony from all of these various entities giving their perspective on why climate change is impacting their business, why a lack of snow is a problem for people, why a fire season has become intolerable for public health and for businesses. Fires, floods, droughts, you name it. There was really credible testimony from people across the state that it's the PSC's job to consider these issues and to try to protect us from harm moving forward. Then in the afternoon, somebody invited all the climate deniers, and we had an afternoon full of the CO2 Coalition, who I'd never heard of before, but is obviously an industry entity that is designed to go around to these type of proceedings and say how climate change is good for us. One of their statements was, CO2 is a miracle molecule, and there is no such thing as drought or wildfire or floods as a result of CO2 emissions. They said black was white and white was black, and it was a mind-numbing presentation from these guys who are still living in the fossil fuel age of the 1960s. So we had the CO2 Coalition, the Heartland Institute. It was the Cato Institute. It was a lineup of people who are paid by the fossil fuel industry to deny climate change. It was unbelievable in this day and age that people are paid to harm our existence on this planet. The Public Service Commission ended the hearing, and then we waited and we waited. The Public Service Commission, just like every other state government entity that has petitioned for a rule, has 60 days to respond, whether it is going to initiate a rulemaking process or whether it is going to deny that petition. Our Public Service Commission waited until after the deadline to make a decision that it was going to extend the public comment period even further. The law clearly requires the Public Service Commission to make a decision on whether to initiate rulemaking to respond to our petition within 60 days. They have no option for an extension. It also requires them to make their decision based on record evidence. Well, we presented a lot of information. We did it in both our petition for rulemaking and we did it at the public hearing. There were reams of scientific studies that are credible and created by real scientists talking about the problem and what other places in this nation are doing to address the problem and consider it. The Public Service Commission obviously didn't feel like it had, I mean, this is my interpretation, didn't feel like it had enough evidence to say that it shouldn't initiate the rulemaking. So it extended the deadline to July 1st. It doesn't have that authority. We believe the Public Service Commission is really doing is trying to stall. The legislature a couple years ago passed a bill that said that no state agency can make a new rule 3 months prior to a legislative session. So what they're trying to do at the PSC is say, we're not going to have enough time to craft this rule to meet the legislature's deadline. We submitted this request with the intention of making sure that the PSC would have sufficient time to craft a rule before that deadline, pre-legislative deadline kicked in. The PSC is stalling. They are trying to avoid having to do their job. So let's see, it was last week, our lawyers, the Western Environmental Law Center and Barbara, who's on the call tonight, and Earth Justice, jointly sent a letter to the Public Service Commission explaining its legal obligation. Now, this is an entity that has plenty of lawyers who can read the black letter of the law just as easily as you and I can. But they sent a letter saying you don't have the right to extend this comment period. You have to make a decision. What's next? We'll see if the PSC does anything, but it is very likely that we're going to have to go to court to force the Public Service Commission to do the job that it simply doesn't want to do, because it is full of a bunch of people who don't care about the climate crisis, who don't believe in it. They don't think it's a real thing. One of them even told me recently that the Public Service Commission really shouldn't be regulating our monopoly utility, because the monopoly utility just knows more than the PSC. And let me tell you, that is somebody who has a fundamental misunderstanding of their job. The Public Service Commission was created to regulate utilities, monopolies that naturally are going to do what's in the best interest of their shareholders. The PSC is supposed to be there to protect us as consumers. Instead, the PSC is ignoring its obligation. They're all earning a big paycheck, and they are not doing their job. And what they're doing is they're guaranteeing that future generations are going to suffer more than they need to, because they don't want to limit emissions of power plants like Northwestern's Colstrip plant or the new gas plant outside of Laurel. It is mind-boggling. It is offensive. It is a disservice to present and future generations. And it absolutely undermines our constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. So you can rest assured, we are not going to just stand by while the Public Service Commission ignores its obligations to protect us as consumers and as Montanans. So what's next? Stay tuned.
And I have a question.
Yeah.
Is it still useful for people to send in public comment?
Well, sorry, one of my headphones died. Maybe. I think we know exactly what the Public Service Commission intends to do. It always feels good to write a letter and get things off your chest. I don't think it's going to sway this commission to actually do its job and follow the law and the Constitution, but it does help that they see that people care enough to continue to submit comments. We have had so many comments submitted on this docket asking the PSC to initiate rulemaking, and yet they stalled until July 1st because it takes them that long to read. I mean, it makes no sense, right? This is just a stall tactic. These guys are paid a lot of money to read those comments. And it seems like if they can't read hundreds of public comments in a few days, how can we expect them to read utility filings? So I don't have a good answer for you. I am frustrated, obviously, and I don't think we're going to get very far with the Public Service Commission at this point, because I just don't think that they have any interest in doing their job.
We got another question. Does the PSC have authority to deny a fossil fuel project?
Gary, that's a great question. What the Public Service Commission does is has the authority to tell a utility that it's not going to pass the costs off on the customers. It will be up to the utility and its shareholders to take the risk building something that it's not going to get recovered in rates. So while the PSC may not be able to say you can't build that, the PSC can say your shareholders have to pay for it, not customers. Your shareholders have to take on that risk, not customers. And that is as good as killing the project.
Thanks. All right, Barbara.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yep.
Great. Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for asking me to talk about where we are with the Held v. State of Montana case, and Katie. I'll give kind of a quick and dirty rundown. I'm sure most of your members here have heard about the case and are probably very familiar with where it's at. But, as most of you know, just over 4 years ago now, we filed a complaint here in District Court in Helena on behalf of 16 young people in Montana, and suing the state of Montana and several agencies for violating their constitutional rights to a clean and healthful environment. The case centered around a challenge to two statutes. One was the State Energy Policy Act, and the other was the Montana Environmental Policy Act, which you've heard quite a bit about already today. The Energy Policy Act claims were dismissed as moot because the legislature interfered in 2023 and just repealed that law altogether. So we were left then with a challenge to MEPA, and we were challenging, and we did challenge successfully, the MEPA limitation that Anne referenced from 2011. And, because the legislature rolled in or changed the law in 2023, Judge Seeley declared that one, kind of included that in her ruling. And so we went to trial last June. We put on testimony from several expert witnesses. Some I see are on this call who have helped with the case. And then most of the youth plaintiffs testified and provided the court with kind of firsthand accounts of their lived experiences dealing with the climate crisis in Montana, and really detailed kind of the real harms that they've been experiencing due to climate change. The experts did a great job of kind of taking, really validating each of the plaintiffs' experiences and explaining, yes, that these harms are real. Here's the science explaining why they're happening. It was just a really compelling several days in court. One of the highlights, of course, was Ann Hedges here tonight, who testified on behalf of the plaintiffs based on her policy experience, and really was central. Her testimony was to just describing how the state of Montana has never denied a fossil fuel permit. And so we, based on all that, the state, and I'll back up, our challenge to the MEPA limitation was that it violated the constitutional rights to a clean and healthful environment in Montana's constitution. And Judge Seeley found in our favor and invalidated that limitation in MEPA. And so the state, the arguments that they have kind of been putting on from the beginning are basically, one, that the plaintiffs do not have standing to challenge this law. Standing requires an injury kind of specific to the parties bringing the lawsuit. It also requires a causation element, meaning that the state of Montana is a cause in the injuries experienced by the plaintiffs. The state argues that, these harms occur to everyone all over the world. Montana's contribution is so de minimis, Montana's actions can't possibly cause the harms or be a cause of the harms that plaintiffs are experiencing. And then finally, the state argued and continues to argue on appeal that MEPA is just a procedural statute. And so no matter what we do with MEPA, no matter what the court says about it, there's no way that invalidating MEPA, a procedural statute according to the state, would have any redressability to plaintiff's injuries. So it couldn't nothing will change according to the state, even if the courts rule in our favor. And so Judge Seeley did not agree and issued a really great order in August of last year, finding in favor of the youth plaintiffs. The case now has been appealed up to the Montana Supreme Court, and the case is fully briefed, meaning the state and the plaintiffs have filed all of the briefs in their case that they're entitled to file. We also had a number of briefs filed by kind of interested parties with what are called like amicus briefs or friends of the court briefs. And so we had like 10 different briefs filed on the side of the plaintiffs in up at the Montana Supreme Court from, for example, the Montana outdoor athletes, Native Nations, Montana trial lawyers, former Montana Supreme Court justices, ACLU, the outdoor recreation industry, children's rights advocates, public health experts. We had just this amazing kind of showing of support through these legal briefings. The state had a number of amicus briefs filed on their behalf as well, including from Northwestern Energy, including from red states, other kind of entities like the U.S. and Montana Chambers of Commerce, legislators in Montana all filed kind of briefs in support of the state's position here. So where we are now is, like I said, the case is fully briefed. The next step is for the Montana Supreme Court to first according to the rules, they assign a 5-justice panel to kind of consider the case and classify it, and meaning the classification is, what type of case is this, and whether the court will make a decision based on the briefs submitted or whether it will request an oral argument, which will happen if 3 justices want an oral argument. And we're pretty, even though an argument's not required or guaranteed, we're pretty certain, or we anticipate that the court will order an oral argument given how much public interest there is in this case. And I think, so we'll stay tuned for that. So we're hoping that an argument will be set by the end of the summer. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that and location, time and date and all that. So I think that's all as far as an update. Just let me know if there's anything I missed and that I should cover. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Barbara. That was wonderful. We appreciate you and your work. And I put in the chat, but the slide should say brief update from Western Environmental Law Center, our invaluable partners. Anne, did you have anything to add?
No, just I do want to, this is a shout out to WELC for their really tremendous work on climate. It is not just the health case, but WELC has been helping MEIC for months now file comments with the DEQ whenever it fails to consider climate change in permitting of fossil fuel projects, and challenging those, or at least getting ready to challenge them when the Supreme Court rules in our favor on the held case or tomorrow's case on MEIC, to be able to reach back and force the state to analyze a lot of these big projects that it's trying to slip in before it had to consider climate change. So we just want a huge shout out to WELC for being such a wonderful partner and so good on these climate issues. Barbara and Melissa in her shop are just a joy to work with. So thank you guys for all your hard work on held and beyond.
Thanks, Anne.
With that, we have a few minutes for questions. So I have been watching the chat and not seeing too many pop in. If you'd like to come off mute, you're totally welcome to do that. I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Okay, I have a question, Katie.
Yeah.
Two actually, probably both for Anne. One is the PSC petition. Is it possible that I had forgotten about the legislative thing overruling their rules, but if they managed to postpone rulemaking until they have put the Laurel methane plant into the rate base. Is that going to be grandfathered in?
Well, Mary, you should get on our legal calls. It's a great question. These are issues that we're grappling with right now as well. We strongly believe the Public Service Commission doesn't have a right to put that case into rate base without considering climate change, and we will fight tooth and nail to make that happen. How that rolls, I don't know. We believe a lot of things are the obligation of the Public Service Commission, and generally they don't agree. So we do know that, EPA just came out with regulations governing greenhouse gas emissions from certain types of new gas plants and coal plants. And while those are good regulations, I think they're a little bit wishy-washy as far as implementation and application to these types of facilities like Northwestern is proposing. But I will say EPA has put Northwestern and all utilities who want to rely on gas on notice. They just filed, and they're accepting informal comments on how it should regulate all of these existing gas plants. There is a process that EPA has initiated to regulate greenhouse gases from existing gas plants. So EPA is telling people like Northwestern Energy or entities like Northwestern Energy, because they are definitely not a person, that they may be subject to regulations in the future on greenhouse gases that will impact the financial viability of that project. And if the Public Service Commission fails to consider that type of risk, then we strongly believe that the PSC has failed to do its job. Those are real risks, and EPA has initiated that process. So you can't just ignore them. And if you do, you are not following the law and doing what the legislature has required of you. So we'll see. There's a lot to unfold in the coming months, as you can imagine. First and foremost, our Supreme Court case. But EPA regulations, I do believe, are going to be a real problem for utilities like Northwestern, who are so focused on only building new gas.
Did you have a second question, Mary?
I do, but I see Gary at least, and maybe others also have questions. So let's let them go first.
All right, well, we'll do Gary's question. What if the PSC denies the petition?
There are 3 branches of government for a reason. Checks and balances.
Well, that's an excellent lead into my question, which is I've heard tomorrow DEQ is going to argue that really the judiciary should have no business reviewing these kinds of permits. Is that true that they're going to do that?
I don't know what their oral argument will be tomorrow, but that definitely is a line that came up in DEQ's briefing before the Supreme Court. And their argument all along has been this is the legislature's obligation. And I suspect that's what the Public Service Commission is going to say too. This is the legislature's obligation. The right to a clean and healthful environment is a fundamental right. It is not limited to what the legislature will or will not allow as far as pollution is concerned. And it is up to the courts to interpret the Constitution when the legislature fails. In this instance, the legislature has abjectly failed in its obligation. Not only has it failed, it has gone backwards, and it has eliminated any consideration for climate change through laws it has passed over strong objections. So we need the court to create the balance that is necessary to implement constitutional rights.
That's telling them.
Here's a good question from Paul in the chat. And we didn't cover this. So, Anne, could you speak to the emerging carbon capture issues in Montana, for example, the Snowy River project and our potential role?
The Snowy River project got some great negative press this week in the Washington Post. We were really, really happy to see that. And I think that's largely thanks to Northern Plains work. But the Snowy River project is a pipeline project that is going to be taking carbon dioxide from Wyoming and putting it in a pipeline up to Montana and putting the carbon dioxide underground. It's important to know where this carbon dioxide is coming from. So you may be under the impression that this might be a good idea because the carbon dioxide is coming from a power plant that would otherwise be spewing CO2 into the atmosphere. What this, in fact, where the CO2 is coming from is it is coming out of the ground in the nation's least productive natural gas field. So if this field, this field is, I forget the number, but it's like 20 or 30% of the gas that it pulls out of the ground is methane gas used for energy generation. Most of it is CO2. They strip that CO2 off. They are going to be piping that up to Montana. They are going to be injecting it underground, and they are going to get huge, huge tax breaks for doing that, which suddenly make pulling that low quality natural gas or gas out of the ground financially viable. So what this is it is a scam on the American taxpayers to make us pay to pull carbon dioxide out of the ground and put it back underground and give Exxon billions of dollars in tax breaks. This is appalling. And it's really appalling when you start reading some of the briefs that have been filed with a court in which a landowner in Montana has sued over the approval of this, or not the approval, but this CO2 pipeline that crosses his property and the damage that they have experienced. These pipelines are dangerous. CO2 pipelines leak, they explode, they cause problems. And if we think that suddenly putting it in a pipe and sending it from Wyoming across the border to a place in Montana is going to be safe, I think people haven't actually paid attention to the harm that is caused from these projects. If anybody from Northern Plains wants to add to any of that, if there's anybody on the call, please feel free. But we have submitted comments with Welk in strong opposition to this project as well. If anybody wants our comments, we'd be happy to share them.
Yeah, I'll put my contact info in the chat. So if you need follow-ups on anything we've talked about tonight, I'm happy to help with that. Any other questions? We're scheduled to go till 5:30, but we don't have to if we've got no more questions.
Yeah, all I can say to Paulette's comment in the chat is if we are going to rely on our legislature to solve the climate crisis, we can just fold up shop now and go home and live like the Don't Look Up movie, because our legislature isn't going to see reason or science anytime soon. So the relying on the legislature, the Public Service Commission, trying to divert attention and say it's the legislature's job is simply an excuse. It is not the truth. Yes, Katie wants us to end on a hopeful note, and I just want to say that's a great idea, because
I was going to say the same thing, and can you leave us? Are there some projects that you're feeling good about? Something in the some solar wind projects, something else that you can leave us with leave us a good feeling with?
How about something obscure but absolutely fantastic? Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has issued rules in which it is going to start making utilities and states plan for more transmission in this country to accommodate our dire need for more renewable resources out of places like Montana. It is long overdue to have true planning of our grid system. Our grid system is old. Our grid system is outdated. There are so many mechanisms we can install in the grid system to get more out of the system we have, whether that's reconductoring lines or grid enhancing technologies. There's so many ways to get more energy moving through the grid system that we have today, but we also need more transmission lines. And we cannot take as much time studying to death a new transmission line as we have in the past. We simply don't have time. So this FERC decision is a really important step forward in making states like Montana have to consider what the future is going to look like. And the future is going to look different than today. And this was a step in the right direction for FERC. I'm sure they're going to be taken to court by people who don't, have a financial interest in the status quo. But I think it is a very positive step in the right direction in order to decarbonize the grid. And then is Amy still on here? I think I saw Amy on here. I do want to say there's a lot of great work going on at the local level, whether that's in Bozeman or Missoula, and other places like Livingston. There's a lot of really great local work that is occurring, trying to get projects on the ground. The EPA is giving out money like mad to try to help people transition to cleaner energy, whether that's through heat pumps or whether that's through solar installation. There is so much money in our system right now to try to incentivize the deployment of clean energy, that I think that is a really, really positive thing. And we don't hear about it much. We don't talk about it much, but those are real dollars that are getting out on the ground that are making a difference. So I think that's great. The other thing that's fantastic, and I think this is the best news, is EPA is finally doing its job. We spent 4 years listening to the EPA talk about how industry should be able to do whatever it wants. Well, a couple of weeks ago, EPA came out with a package of rules to try to make power plants decrease their externalities, trying to make those power plant owners have to pay the true cost of generating coal and gas. And they came out with rules to protect water. They came out with rules to protect us from faulty coal ash storage. They came out with rules on greenhouse gas emissions for coal and new gas-fired power plants. And most importantly, they came out with the mercury and air toxics rule, which is designed to protect public health, to do what EPA was charged by Congress to do back in 1990, which is to limit harmful emissions of toxic air pollutions from coal-fired power plants. It just so happens that Montana has the plant that has the highest emissions of toxics in the nation. So I think what EPA just did is an amazing and heartening step forward. It showed courage in the face of political adversity. It showed that they were following the law and willing to follow the law, even though all these attorney generals like ours are going to take them to court over it. And it showed that they are doing their job, which is to protect the public, not protect the industries that are able to collect a lot of money by externalizing their true costs. So I think these rules really help level the playing field and make these guys have to pay their fair share. And I think that is super encouraging and a giant step in the right direction.
You're here. More local news, Billings Climate Week, which Katie just mentioned, has confirmed Bill McKibben will be here in September. And we'll have a week long of other events and speakers and movies and so on. Plus, we want as many communities as possible to Zoom in to hear Bill McKibben. So if your community wants to do that and we prefer not that people just, do it in their living rooms, but that there'd be a community gathering to watch it. So if anybody wants to try and organize that, probably the easiest thing to do is get in touch with Katie about, how to hook into that.
Will he be here in person or via?
Yes, he will be in Montana.
Great.
That's great, Mary. That's exciting.
Yeah.
Great. Those were wonderful, hopeful things, and I appreciate that that's potentially where we're going to end tonight. Lots of good work happening, lots of progress. So onward. All right.
And
Thanks
thank you
everybody
for
for
doing
joining.
this. It's
Yeah.
so great to get updates like this. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for coming.